It is July the 20th, 2026, and somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz, one crew member from the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy is still unaccounted for. The ship was struck by the IRGC in the early hours of July 12th. Its engine room set ablaze, the crew forced to abandon into a lifeboat in a waterway Iran had formally committed in writing to keep safe. While the ship burned, Iran's parliament speaker posted the text of that very commitment on social media, citing it as evidence Iran was honoring the agreement, posting the words promising safe passage while the vessel his government's forces had just struck was still on fire. That is the strategic situation that produced 140 Iranian military targets going dark in a single night, the third consecutive escalating wave of American precision strikes that brought the campaign's confirmed total past 300 destroyed Iranian military assets across that week. Iran had declared the strait formally closed. 3 nights of American air power provided the operational answer to that disagreement. Understanding how that answer was constructed, the sequencing, the weapons, the doctrine, and the intelligence architecture behind it is what makes this moment in the conflict distinct from what preceded it. But let's back all the way up, because the 140 target third night did not arrive without a specific sequence of events that made it close to inevitable. The trigger was the IRGC's strike on the GFS Galaxy, a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting eastbound through the strait after departing Jebel Ali, hit by a projectile that caused severe engine room damage, and a fire that left the vessel unable to continue its voyage. The crew abandoned ship, and one crew member remains missing according to reporting citing UKMTO and Central Command. This was not a navigation error or an accidental engagement in contested waters. It was a strike on a commercial vessel transiting a waterway that was, at the time, governed by a memorandum of understanding Iran's own parliament speaker had publicly cited as being in effect, an agreement committing Iran to using its best efforts toward the safe passage of commercial shipping. Hours after the Galaxy was burning, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all vessels, the 4th such closure declaration since the war began in late February, claiming that vessels using unauthorized routes without coordinating with Iranian naval authorities were subject to interdiction. Central Command's public response was not a diplomatic protest. It was, in effect, a targeting list. Night 1 hit roughly 80 confirmed Iranian military targets. Night 2 hit around 90. Night 3 hit approximately 140 in a single operational window: missile and drone launch sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage, communications networks, and the coastal surveillance infrastructure Iran uses to identify and direct strikes against vessels transiting the strait's approaches. That progression, upward each night rather than flat or front-loaded, is itself a form of communication. A single maximum strike on night 1 demonstrates overwhelming force, but says nothing about the capacity to sustain it. A campaign escalating from 80 to 90 to 140 across 3 consecutive nights tells Iran, and everyone else watching, that the ceiling of available strike capacity has not yet been reached. Iran's chief negotiator posting the underlying memorandum's text, while the ship it committed to protect was still burning, deserves specific attention, because the exact language he posted reveals the interpretation Iran has been operating under more clearly than any outside analysis could construct. The relevant passage commits Iran to using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels through the waterway for a defined period. Best efforts, in ordinary contract usage, is a less demanding standard than an outcome guarantee, requiring only diligent, sincere effort rather than achieved results. Iran's apparent interpretation extends that qualifier further still. If Iran's own arrangement for safe passage is read as requiring advanced coordination with Iranian naval authorities, then a vessel that does not coordinate has, in that framing, placed itself outside the safe passage the arrangement was meant to protect. That is not a good faith reading of what the agreement was designed to accomplish. It is a definitional exploitation that converts a commitment to open transit into a legal architecture for an Iranian-administered toll system over the strait, and the 3-night, 300-plus target campaign functions as the operational rejection of that architecture, a demonstration that the physical capability required to run that system is not something Iran can preserve simply by redefining the terms of what it signed. The coastal surveillance architecture was a primary target category across all 3 nights, and it deserves explanation because its military significance is less immediately obvious than a missile battery's. Coastal radar and communications installations at positions along Iran's southeastern and Gulf coastline give Iranian commanders the ability to track vessels approaching the strait, speed, heading, flag, escort status, and to direct drone or cruise missile strikes against specific identified ships rather than firing in the general direction of a shipping lane. Remove that surveillance and communications network, and the difference is the difference between a directed threat and an undirected one, a fast attack boat that can identify and pursue a specific vessel versus one moving toward a shipping lane hoping to encounter something. The campaign's systematic targeting of that surveillance layer, radar dish by radar dish, communications tower by communications tower, is therefore not a secondary effort running alongside strikes on missile batteries and boats. It is the component that renders those other capabilities operationally blind, rather than merely reduced in number. And it carries a second function beyond ship tracking, since a functioning Iranian radar network also provides warning of incoming American strike packages, letting an air defense commander cue missile systems against approaching aircraft, suppress that network with radar hunting anti-radiation missiles, and the same commander is left blind, unable to generate a fire control solution, forced to choose between activating a radar and risking an immediate strike on his own antenna, or leaving it off and seeing nothing. Ammunition depot strikes represent a category whose significance unfolds over time. A unit that has expended its immediate inventory but can resupply from a nearby depot can continue operating with minimal pause. A unit whose local depot has been destroyed must wait on resupply through logistics channels that reporting indicates have themselves been disrupted, converting Iran's weapons inventory from a continuously replenished resource into a finite, diminishing one. The specific weapons configurations reported for these strikes add an analytical dimension worth understanding. Fighter aircraft equipped with laser-guided rocket systems, cheaper per unit than air-to-air missiles and designed specifically to intercept lightweight aerial targets, reflect an American side deliberately matching the volume of Iranian drone activity with a cost-appropriate interceptor, rather than expending expensive missile inventory against inexpensive drones. Dual-mode guided bombs that can fall back on GPS guidance to a target's last known coordinate if a laser lock is broken mid-flight, let strike pilots maneuver defensively against surviving Iranian air defense without losing the weapon, a detail that reflects an airspace still active enough, even after suppression, to force real-time defensive reactions from attacking aircraft. Iran's response through this period has included continued ballistic missile launches at Gulf states and the deployment of a domestically produced, reverse-engineered anti-ship cruise missile with a reported range exceeding 100 nautical miles, giving coastal batteries the ability to threaten vessels well outside the immediate strait approaches. The campaign's targeting of the surveillance and communications layer is specifically aimed at degrading Iran's ability to employ that missile against chosen targets, converting it from a directed threat into an undirected one. Sea mines Iran has laid in the strait represent the piece of this picture air power alone cannot resolve. A mine requires no command link, no radar, no human decision at the moment of detonation. It awaits. Clearing a minefield requires dedicated countermeasures operations on a timeline measured in weeks rather than hours, and it is the element of Iranian strait capability most resistant to a campaign built primarily around striking surveillance, communications, and launch infrastructure, because it is passive and does not depend on any of that. Here it's worth pausing on a specific figure that deserves more scrutiny than it sometimes receives in circulating commentary about this period. Claims that roughly 800 commercial vessels and 400 million barrels of crude moved through the strait during this window sit in tension with other contemporaneous reporting, which describes commercial transit collapsing sharply after the closure declaration, down from dozens of transits a day before the latest closure to roughly a dozen a day afterward, alongside a sharp repricing of war risk insurance. Both things may be partially true depending on the exact window and vessel categories being measured, but the more dramatic transit figures should be treated cautiously rather than repeated as a settled count, since the available reporting on shipping volumes through this specific period points toward a significant contraction in traffic, not business as usual transit at pre-crisis volumes. What does appear consistent across sources is that Iran's declared closure did not achieve a full, uncontested shutdown of the waterway, and that a meaningful, if reduced, volume of shipping continued moving through under close American naval and air oversight. On the broader intelligence picture, Dutch intelligence services disclosed in mid-July that a Russian-linked hacking group had been compromising internet-connected cameras, including some positioned along military logistics routes in the Netherlands and other NATO countries, using them to gather visibility into military transport and equipment deliveries to Ukraine, a real and separately confirmed disclosure. Separate reporting around the same period noted a spike in scanning and exploitation attempts against similar camera systems across Israel and several Gulf states attributed to actors linked to the Iranian government, apparently seeking street-level imagery for targeting support and battle damage assessment. Those two threads, a Russian camera compromise operation aimed at NATO logistics and a parallel Iranian-linked camera targeting effort in the Gulf, are both independently reported. A more specific claim circulating in some commentary, that the exact camera compromise technique was also the method used to locate senior Iranian leadership ahead of the strikes that opened this war in February, is not something the Dutch disclosure itself establishes. And it is worth treating that particular connection as speculative framing, rather than a confirmed link between the two operations. The broader lesson from both camera compromise threads, regardless of whether they connect to each other, is one operational security analysts have been flagging for years. Ordinary internet-connected devices, doorbell cameras, business security systems, consumer electronics, running factory default passwords, constitute a surveillance surface available to any actor with fairly modest technical capability, far less sophistication than most other forms of intelligence collection against a hardened target require. That asymmetry, low effort to compromise a device, potentially high intelligence value from what it can see, is what makes this kind of collection attractive to state actors on multiple sides of unrelated conflicts simultaneously, and it is a vulnerability that is not specific to this war or this region. It shows up wherever military logistics routes intersect with the ordinary, poorly secured consumer technology that surrounds them. The strategic assessment of where Iran's negotiating position actually stands after this stretch of strikes is where the incoherence of its public messaging becomes most visible. Iran's chief negotiator posted that the era of one-sided deals is over, while his own government was actively violating the specific deal, whose text he cited as proof of compliance. That is not simply a communications misstep. It reflects a position claiming compliance with an agreement while violating its substance, claiming control over a waterway that continued to see shipping move through it under American oversight, and claiming battlefield successes that Central Command's own accounting does not support. That incoherence looks less like strategic confusion and more like the communication output of a command structure attempting to sustain a domestic narrative that is increasingly disconnected from its own operational reality. What Iran appears to actually want out of this situation differs from what it says publicly. It wants relief from the economic pressure, the blocked revenue, the disabled tankers, the naval blockade. It wants to preserve its ballistic missile program as a deterrent rather than accept constraints on it. And it wants to retain enough straight leverage that any eventual agreement looks like it extracted real concessions rather than representing capitulation. Those objectives are difficult to hold simultaneously in the current environment because every night of continued strikes reduces the leverage available to secure them. Another radar site going dark, another depot destroyed, another boat taken off the board. Iran's remaining external resupply channels are constrained on multiple fronts at once. A previously used rail corridor reportedly destroyed, a naval blockade in place, and its two principal potential suppliers, each facing their own limits. Russia occupied with its own war in Ukraine and absorbing strikes on its own energy infrastructure. China facing a risk calculus around open resupply shipments that reporting suggests it has been unwilling to accept at scale. None of that isolation is total, but it appears sufficient to ensure that what has been destroyed across this campaign is not being replaced at anywhere near the rate it is being destroyed, a gap that compounds with every additional night. The GFS Galaxy is still the starting point of this particular chapter. One crew member is still missing. The ship was set ablaze in a waterway Iran had committed in writing to keep safe. Iran's chief negotiator said the era of one-sided deals was over, while posting the text of the deal his own forces had just violated. He may have been right about one part of that statement, just not the part he intended. The arrangement that was genuinely one-sided was the one Iran appears to have believed it had, in which it could sign a defined commitment to safe passage, immediately begin enforcing its own transit permission system on top of it, and expect the other side to accept that redefinition rather than respond with a targeting list. There's a broader pattern worth naming across this specific memorandum's short life. This is not the first time a safe passage framework negotiated for the Strait has collapsed under exactly this kind of definitional dispute. Earlier arrangements reached during pauses in this conflict have repeatedly run into the same structural problem. An agreement written in language flexible enough for both sides to sign, interpreted by Iran in a way that preserves its ability to control who transits and under what conditions, and interpreted by Washington and by international shipping interests as a straightforward commitment to open passage. Every time that gap surfaces, it surfaces the same way, with an attack on a vessel, a public claim of compliance from Tehran, and a strike package in response. That repetition suggests the problem is not incidental drafting language that a better worded agreement could fix on the next attempt. It suggests a genuine, unresolved disagreement between the two sides about what kind of waterway the Strait of Hormuz actually is, an open international passage that no single state can condition in the American and international legal view, or a waterway. Iran believes it retains the sovereign right to manage and permission, a view its actions have consistently reflected, regardless of what language it agrees to on paper. Any future arrangement that does not resolve that underlying disagreement explicitly, rather than papering over it with best efforts language, is likely to fail the same way this one did. 3 nights and more than 300 struck targets later, the Strait is neither fully open in the sense of uncontested commercial transit, nor closed in the sense Iran's declaration intended. It sits somewhere in between, contested, degraded on the Iranian side, and still moving a reduced but real volume of shipping under American oversight. with the mine threat still sitting in the water as the one element of Iran's strait capability that strikes alone have not been able to remove. That combination, a waterway simultaneously open enough to keep commerce moving and dangerous enough to keep war risk premiums elevated and insurers nervous, is likely to define this specific stretch of the conflict for as long as the underlying disagreement about who controls the strait remains unresolved on paper as well as in practice.